Professor Zuber-Skerritt, convener of the third postgraduate research and supervision program, funded by the Federal Department of Employment, Education and Training, Australia. Professor Zuber-Skerritt introduces this video program.
The videos are based on recordings of a staff development program for supervisors of postgraduate students in the newly amalgamated university campuses. This program was held at the Hyatt Regency on the Gold Coast of Queensland in Australia in September 1995. New university campuses, established since 1987, have experienced many exciting challenges. These can be observed in at least 4 areas. 1. Staff facing the transition from a purely teaching role to the responsibilities as researchers and teachers of postgraduate research students. 2. Staff having to teach increasing numbers of postgraduate students with reduced resources. This has often led to increased staff workload and stress. 3. Universities facing increasing accountability to research students, society, employers and taxpayers. All these stakeholders have a legitimate right to expect this accountability in terms of quality outcomes and cost effectiveness. 4. Staff being expected to upgrade their academic qualifications through PhD studies, while at the same time having to supervise postgraduate research students. How then can we assist the new university campuses in further improving the quality of postgraduate education and fostering an institutional research culture? This video series and accompanying written materials aim, first, to improve the quality of university teaching and learning at the postgraduate level in the new university campuses. 2. To develop postgraduate supervision skills in a way which will achieve a multiplier effect in each institution. 3. To provide support materials, of which these videos are a part, and which can be used by the participants and others in their own institutions. 4. To address existing and new issues in postgraduate supervision and generate solutions to these problems from the participants themselves, in conjunction with national and international leaders in this field. I hope you will appreciate the following video.
Well, good evening, everyone. The session that I'm going to be conducting this evening, I've called a reflective approach to reviewing the literature. And what I'm going to do is to make a few general remarks, and introductory remarks, talk about the aims and the structure of the session before I actually move into the main part of the session itself. And this will actually be an interactive workshop. I want you to actually use the resources which I have created over the years with students and staff that I've been working with. I hope you'll find them of value. During this session, I want to look at the literature review as a miniature version of the larger research process. All the processes that we've been discussing over the last couple of days, such as articulating the research problem, constructing the theoretical frameworks, data gathering, synthesizing and reporting, are all also part of the processes of the literature review. And just as we need to identify the aims of our research, we also need to identify the aims of our literature reviews. We need to establish how best to gather the data for them. We need to learn to manage and integrate that data in order to say something meaningful about the existing discipline framework, or indeed the interdisciplinary framework and how that relates to our research. And I think you'll agree that taking a critical or a reflective approach to the research process is something that we all as researchers work very hard at, and we want to try to encourage our students to begin to take that same reflective approach to their work. In this particular session, I'm going to introduce you to practical strategies for encouraging a critical or a reflective approach to reviewing the literature. I've been introduced to a whole range of models of teaching and learning. Yoni mentioned the andragogical model earlier this morning. I think the ones that have most influenced my work in this area have been the reflective practitioner model, which Donald Schoen is a proponent of, the action research and action learning model from my interaction with Autrin and Patricia Weeks, and the conceptual change model of learning. But when I talk about conceptual change here, I'm talking about the conceptual change model as propounded by Ferenc Marton and others, rather than the sort of conceptual change related to cognitive psychology. Now, there are going to be 4 key elements to this afternoon's program, and these are related to the workshop aims. The workshop aims are actually stated on the title page of your handouts to the session this afternoon. I did mention to someone earlier that those handouts have actually been designed so that you can use this workshop in your own institutions. The first element is to introduce you to the reflective model of information searching. What I'll do is I'll actually review the model, and I'll introduce you to those resources which I've designed to help people work with this reflective model of information searching. Then I'm going to touch on research which has highlighted difficulties related to the literature review, and some of you may choose to focus on this area when we work in small groups later on. You might also spend some time actually devising strategies for dealing with problems experienced by students and supervisors in the literature review process. And if you decide to do that, I'd encourage you to think about your own problems, the ones which you and your students experience, rather than drawing from the problems which I've identified from the literature. Finally, we'll spend hopefully 3/4 of an hour, if possible, actually using and reflecting on the suggested resources. So the structure of the session is going to be an introduction to some background theory. I'm going to look at the literature review itself, the reflective model for information searching, and when I look at the reflective model, I'm going to focus on what it is, why we use it, and how we can use it. Then we will do our usual workshop situation, which we've been used to. Let's just take a moment to focus on what the literature review is and what its purpose is in the research process. I hope many of you've got your book of readings here, which was sent out to us before the conference. If you turn to section 5, you'll find a copy of a book chapter called Supervising Literature Reviews. There's a definition of the literature review there. The process of the literature review involves the researcher in exploring the literature to establish the status quo, formulate a problem or research inquiry, defend the value of pursuing the line of inquiry established, and compare the findings and ideas with his or her own. Now, there is another part to the literature review definition apart from the process, and that's the product. The product involves the synthesis of the work of others in a form which demonstrates the accomplishment of that exploratory process. Okay. The next thing I'd like to look at are supervisors and students' experiences of the literature review. Supervisors' expectations and students' expectations don't necessarily coalesce, and they're quite often very different. So firstly, we look at the problems that both of these groups experience. And I've pulled this from a number of research papers that were written in the very late 1980s. So these papers have established that the literature review is actually a problem area for many students, and okay, not all students, some fly through the literature review process. Students are reluctant to complete the literature review. many students are actually unsure of what constitutes an adequate review, and others are uncertain of the role of the literature review in the whole process. Now, it's very difficult to actually do a literature review under these circumstances. These problems for students are actually compounded by a lack of supervisory guidance, by a lack of information searching skills, and this is on the part of students, and by a lack of clarification of the research problem. And here we have the chicken and the egg thing. Does the literature review help you clarify the research problem, or should you have the research problem clarified before you start to approach the literature? I think it's a little bit of both. Students expect guidance in their literature searching, and they expect guidance in bibliographic techniques, and this is probably a fairly tall order for many supervisors these days with the rapid changes that are going on in the information and information technology environment. They also expect information about personal contacts and references which will be useful in their literature review. So they really would like us to hand over all the papers that they need to write the literature review. Let's have a look now at what supervisors expect. And of course there is some conflict here. Supervisors expect students to already have literature searching skills. They don't expect to have to give them guidance in bibliographic techniques. In fact, many supervisors will freely admit to not having the literature searching skills themselves that are required. In a doctoral study that was completed by a lady called Zuber-Skerritt, she discovered that supervisors in fact admit to giving the literature review the least time and energy when compared with other parts of the thesis. And they also rank the literature review lowest in terms of personal expertise. Now, the literature review might not be what you allocate least time and energy to, and I'm sure it's not low in your area of personal expertise, but I'm hoping that what we will be able to do is gain some extra resources and extra information through this time, which we'll be able to pass on to students. Okay. Well, let's move on now to look at the reflective model. This is the second edition of a model for information searching which I've been developing over a period of time. It is into the third edition now, but I wasn't completed in its third edition when I sent out the handouts for this workshop, so we're still working with the second edition. The main components of this model are that one should actually engage in the various processes which are very similar to those of action learning, of planning, acting, recording and reflecting. And you'll notice that I've got a personal information style at the centre of that model, and that's because I believe that despite the fact that people can systematically go through processes very usefully, we will all do so in very different ways. And some of my friends from the School of Architecture talk about those ways in terms of heuristics. So we develop our own information heuristics, and we don't necessarily like to be forced into doing things the way we're told to because of the type of people we are. Well, in terms of my model, that's okay. The important thing is to be able to make plans, to be able to either act yourself or to be able to get someone else to implement the plans for you, to keep records, and this is the hardest part, the one we are slackest about, but it's very important when you're doing something over 3, 4, 5, 6 or even 7-year period to be able to recall exactly what you have implemented in the past, and then to spend time systematically reflecting and replanning. This particular model is one of the key ways in which supervisors can actually provide support to students in the process of the literature review, introducing them to this model and to specific strategies for engaging in those various parts of the process. Now, why adopt a reflective approach? Well, I think it fosters critical thinking, and it also encourages new researchers to adopt what I call complex conceptions of their literature review as early as possible. A few years ago, I did a study into the different ways in which postgraduate students conceive of literature reviews, and again, some people who participated in that study are here today. And the study showed that there are at least 6 different ways in which beginning research students conceive of their literature review. And you've got the main labels for those conceptions up in front of you, but just to tell you a little bit more about them, and you don't need to make notes about this, again, it's all in that chapter which I mentioned before. I'll just run through those different ways so you understand exactly what they are. Right at the bottom left, you can see that some people see the literature review as a list of bibliographic citations. And this might be supplemented by abstracts or by names of important journals in the field. It would not surprise me if you asked a student the first time they came into the office what they thought they would have to do for a literature review, if that was the sort of response they gave you. Others think that literature reviews are searches in which a range of bibliographic tools and personal contacts are used to identify pertinent literature. Then there's a survey conception in which documents are read for the purpose of outlining existing knowledge in the field. There's the vehicle for learning conception in which the student begins to use the literature to learn as much as possible about the field being explored. Then the research facilitator conception, and here the literature is seen as supporting, influencing, directing or shaping or changing in some way the student's research. And finally, it's seen as a report in which the student frames a discourse about the field of knowledge which they have been engaged with. Now, I said earlier that some of these conceptions are more complex than others, not because some are right and some are wrong, but because there are qualitatively different relations going on between the student and the literature, depending upon how they're conceiving of the actual process. And in the bottom part of the hierarchy, if you like, those relations are indirect. And as you move up the hierarchy, there are more and more interactive relationships, literally from a single direct relation to 2 and 3-way interactions between the person and the literature. And I think that as supervisors, we need to ensure that our students are thinking about the literature in all of those ways from as early as possible in the actual process that they're working on. Now that brings me to the actual resources in which we're going to use to help students adopt a reflective approach. And I'd like to actually walk through these with you. You've got them in your handouts, and because you're going to be using them, I'd like to take you through them one by one. The first resource number A, is to do with the central part of the model for reflective information searching, and it's to do with considering your personal information gathering style. Basically, on page 3, what you have are a whole lot of prompts which will help researchers, and this is just as effective for experienced researchers as it is for beginning research students, prompts to help you reflect on your own information gathering style. Then you're invited to compare your responses with those of colleagues. Once you've done that, you might like to look at the categories of information seekers on the next page, which is sort of a resource attached to page 3. A lady by the name of Judith Palmer did a lot of research with large numbers of scientists actually, but I think it's relevant to those of us who are not scientists as well, depending upon how you understand the term scientist. And she categorized information seekers in 5 different ways. I think you'll find them quite enlightening and enjoyable. On page 5, I have some material to assist in the planning stages of the literature search. although these are things that will happen again and again throughout the process of the literature review, it's important that people do them at the very beginning of the process so that they get some sense of direction for where they're going. So the first catalyst is to actually dissect your topic in some way that you're comfortable with, and then working from the above, identify key discipline areas, important keywords, authors, etc. And finally, questions that you hope will be answered by the literature review. And that's an important one, because if you can actually state questions that you hope your literature review will answer, it's going to guide you in evaluating the information that's retrieved. Now, all of those questions relate to, on page 6, the second and third part of the search strategy diagram, analysing the problem and identifying keywords. Again, if you have a look at page 6, think about it as a resource to be used in relation to the planning of the literature search on page 5. On page 7, we move on to the third part of the model, that is recording plans and activity. Recording really is a strategy for insisting that students keep notes of what they've been doing, making records of the plans they've made and of the activity that they've actually implemented. And if there are any students in the group here, you might want to think back over what you've done over the last 6 months and actually write it down. I found this is something that I've had to train myself to do in my own PhD, and it really is helpful when 3 years after you've done a literature search, you don't have to recreate it all over again, because you can go back and look at the strategy that you used the last time and you know how up to date you are because it's all been written down. Now, the final part of these resources are the reflection resources, and there are a number of these on page 8, 9 and 10. I am very committed, as you know, to the reflection part of this model. It's what it's all about, which is why there's more resources for the reflection phase than for the others. On page 8, you've got prompts that will assist in looking at the literature review in terms of a broad picture. And I've used the conceptions of literature reviews in order to formulate those prompts. On page 9, there are prompts to encourage you to look at the literature review in order to avoid common deficiencies that are identified in the literature. So that looks at things which the literature states are associated with poor quality literature reviews. And on page 10, there's a list of things which the literature states are associated with high quality literature reviews. So you can critique your own work in both of those ways. What I'd like to do is to invite you now to actually use those resources, or two options for your group activity. Either consider the difficulties experienced by supervisors in supervising literature reviews, or the students in conducting the literature review, then actually suggest or develop strategies for overcoming the problems. And as I mentioned before, if you choose that one, choose problems that people are currently experiencing in the group. So work with your own problems rather than the ones that came up on the overhead earlier. And the second option is to actually use those resources which we've just walked through and discuss, once you've used them, if you're a PhD student, in your relation to your PhD research. If you're not a PhD student, then perhaps in relation to some research project that you're working on now. Think about how your students would benefit from using those resources and in what ways they could be modified to suit your students' needs. If you get this far, think about other strategies that you have used which you might be able to share with participants. Okay, so it's over to you now to work on one or other of those options.
Please stop the tape, allow 20 to 30 minutes for groups to answer the questions, and appoint a spokesperson to report.